You've been told your entire life that the system just needs a few tweaks, some reforms, better regulations, nicer politicians, and everything will be fine. You've been convinced that capitalism can be made humane, sustainable, and just if we only vote harder, petition louder, and believe stronger in gradual change. But what if everything you've been taught about reform is a carefully constructed lie designed to keep you hoping for improvement while ensuring nothing fundamental ever changes? Angela Davis, the revolutionary intellectual whose life has been dedicated to understanding and dismantling systems of oppression, has spent decades proving a truth so dangerous that the ruling class will do anything to suppress it. Capitalism isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed. And a system designed on exploitation, extraction, and endless accumulation cannot be reformed into something humane. It can only be replaced. Prepare to have your liberal dreams shattered and your revolutionary consciousness awakened. Angela Davis understands something that destroys every comfortable assumption about economic reform. Capitalism isn't a neutral system that can be guided toward justice. It's a system that requires injustice to function. The exploitation, inequality, and suffering you see aren't bugs in the capitalist program. They're features without which the system cannot operate. At its core, capitalism is based on a fundamental relationship. Those who own the means of production extract value from those who must sell their labor to survive. This isn't a relationship that can be made equal or fair because it's structurally unequal by design. The capitalist must extract more value from workers than they pay in wages, or there would be no profit and no capitalism. This means that workers must always be exploited for the system to function. You can raise the minimum wage, improve working conditions, strengthen labor protections, but you cannot eliminate the fundamental exploitation at the heart of the system without destroying capitalism itself. Every reform that improves workers' conditions reduces capitalist profits, which creates pressure to find new forms of exploitation. Automation that displaces workers, outsourcing to countries with weaker labor protections, financialization that extracts wealth from communities, environmental destruction that externalizes costs onto future generations. Davis sees that this dynamic extends far beyond individual workplaces to entire societies and the global system. Rich countries maintain their wealth by extracting resources and labor from poor countries. White communities maintain their advantages by extracting value from communities of color. Men maintain their economic dominance by extracting unpaid labor from women. These aren't separate systems that can be reformed independently. They're interconnected aspects of a single system that requires hierarchy and exploitation to function. This is why every genuine reform movement eventually comes up against the same wall. Meaningful change that actually addresses root causes threatens the fundamental logic of capitalism, which means it threatens the power of the class that benefits from capitalism. At that point, reforms are either abandoned, co-opted, or crushed. The system allows changes that don't threaten its core logic, while violently resisting changes that do. Davis's analysis of the prison industrial complex reveals how capitalism doesn't just tolerate injustice. It requires injustice to create new markets and extract profit from human suffering. The explosion of incarceration in the United States since the 1970s isn't a response to increasing crime. It's the creation of a new form of racialized capitalism that generates profits from caging human beings. When slavery was formally abolished, the economic system that depended on black labor didn't disappear. It evolved. The 13th Amendment banned slavery except as punishment for crime, creating a constitutional loophole that allowed the continuation of forced labor through the criminal justice system. Convict leasing, chain gangs, and prison farms maintained the economic extraction of black labor under new legal forms. The modern prison system extends this logic. Private prison corporations profit directly from incarceration, creating economic incentives for longer sentences and higher recidivism rates. Even public prisons generate profits for corporations that provide food, healthcare, telecommunications, and other services. The families of incarcerated people become consumers forced to pay inflated prices for phone calls, commissary items, and visits. Entire communities become economically dependent on prisons for employment. But Davis shows that the prison system serves capitalism in an even more fundamental way. It disappears the surplus populations created by economic policies that prioritize capital over human needs. When factories close and communities are economically devastated, when public services are privatized and social supports are eliminated, when education and healthcare become unaffordable commodities, large numbers of people become redundant to the formal economy. Rather than acknowledging that the economic system creates these problems, capitalism criminalizes the people it makes redundant. Poverty becomes a crime. Addiction becomes a crime. Mental illness becomes a crime. Homelessness becomes a crime. The same people who are excluded from meaningful economic participation are then caged for the crimes of survival. This serves multiple functions. It removes troublesome populations from public view. It disciplines the working class by demonstrating what happens to those who fall out of the system. And it creates new markets for capital investment. Davis's experience in radical movements has taught her that liberal reform isn't just inadequate. It actively prevents the fundamental changes necessary for genuine liberation. Liberal reform operates by addressing symptoms while preserving the systems that create the problems, creating the illusion of progress while ensuring that core power structures remain intact. Consider how criminal justice reform works in practice. Liberals call for police reform, body cameras, bias training, community policing, all changes that accept the fundamental premise that armed agents of the state should patrol working-class communities and communities of color. These reforms may reduce some forms of police violence while preserving the institution of policing itself, which exists to protect property relations and maintain social order in an unequal society. Similarly, prison reform focuses on making incarceration more humane rather than questioning whether mass incarceration should exist at all. Prison education programs, rehabilitation services, and re-entry support may help individual prisoners while preserving the system that creates the conditions requiring mass incarceration in the first place. The prison industrial complex adapts to incorporate these reforms while continuing to expand. This dynamic repeats across every area where reform is attempted. Healthcare reform focuses on expanding access to medical services rather than questioning why healthcare is a commodity to be bought and sold. Environmental reform focuses on technological solutions and market mechanisms rather than questioning an economic system that requires endless growth on a finite planet. Education reform focuses on improving schools rather than questioning why education reproduces class inequality. Davis sees that liberal reform fails because it operates within the logic of the system it claims to change. It accepts the fundamental premises of capitalism: private property, profit maximization, market competition, while trying to mitigate their worst effects. But these effects aren't accidental byproducts of an otherwise sound system. They're necessary consequences of the system's core logic. One of Davis's most important insights is that racism, sexism, and capitalism aren't separate systems that occasionally intersect. They're interconnected aspects of a single system that requires multiple forms of oppression to function. This means that none of these forms of oppression can be eliminated without addressing the others, and none can be addressed without confronting capitalism itself. The exploitation of women's unpaid domestic labor subsidizes capitalism by reducing the costs of reproducing the workforce. If corporations had to pay for all the cooking, cleaning, childcare, elder care, and emotional labor currently performed for free by women, labor costs would increase dramatically. The maintenance of patriarchal family structures ensures that this essential work continues to be performed without compensation. Similarly, racism serves capitalism by creating divisions within the working class that prevent unified resistance to exploitation. When white workers can be convinced that their problems are caused by black and brown workers rather than by the capitalists who exploit all workers, they become allies of their exploiters rather than their natural allies in the struggle for justice. Davis shows that these divisions aren't natural or accidental. They're actively maintained by policies and practices that pit oppressed groups against each other. Immigration enforcement creates fear that prevents undocumented workers from organizing for better conditions, which drives down wages for all workers. Criminal justice policies that disproportionately target black and brown communities create barriers to employment that force people into informal and illegal economies, which are then used to justify further criminalization. The intersectional nature of oppression means that reforms that address one form of oppression while ignoring others often end up reinforcing the system as a whole. Women's entry into the professional workforce without changing the sexual division of labor just creates new forms of exploitation for working-class women who are hired to perform domestic labor for professional women. Anti-racist policies that increase black representation in police departments and corporate boardrooms don't challenge the institutions of policing and capitalism that create racial oppression. Davis reveals that the most insidious aspect of liberal reform is its violence. Not the obvious violence of repression, but the subtle violence of false hope that channels revolutionary energy into harmless activities while preserving the systems that create suffering. Reform movements often become forms of system maintenance disguised as system change. When people's anger and frustration are channeled into petition drives, electoral campaigns, and lobbying efforts that operate within existing institutional frameworks, their energy is captured and redirected away from activities that might actually threaten power. The system benefits from this energy because it creates the appearance of democratic participation while ensuring that the participation happens on terms that don't challenge fundamental power structures. The violence of reform is that it promises relief from suffering while ensuring that the suffering continues. It offers hope for improvement while preventing the changes that would actually create improvement. It allows people to feel like they're working for justice while ensuring that injustice is maintained. This is psychologically devastating for people who pour their lives into reform movements only to see the problems they're fighting against get worse despite their efforts. Davis has seen this dynamic repeatedly throughout her life. The civil rights movement won important legal victories that eliminated formal segregation, but economic inequality between black and white communities has actually increased since the 1960s. The feminist movement won important gains in legal equality, but women still perform the vast majority of unpaid domestic labor and face persistent wage gaps. The environmental movement has raised awareness about ecological destruction, but carbon emissions and environmental degradation have accelerated despite decades of activism. This isn't because the movements failed or their participants weren't committed enough. It's because they operated within systems designed to absorb and neutralize challenges to fundamental power relations. The reforms they won were real and meaningful for individuals, but they didn't address the systemic roots of the problems they were fighting against. Davis understands that capitalism is a global system that requires global resistance. You can't create socialism in one country when that country is embedded in a global capitalist economy that punishes any deviation from market logic. This is why every attempt at creating alternatives within existing nation-states faces immediate and overwhelming pressure from global capital. Look at what happens to countries that attempt to prioritize human needs over corporate profits. They face economic sanctions, capital flight, currency manipulation, and often military intervention. Cuba has survived decades of economic blockade for attempting to build socialism. Venezuela faces constant economic warfare for trying to use oil revenues for social programs rather than private profit. Bolivia's government was overthrown in a coup when it tried to nationalize lithium resources. This international dimension reveals why reform within individual countries is structurally limited. When corporations can simply move production to countries with lower wages and weaker environmental protections, national reforms that increase costs for capital are undermined by global competition. When financial markets can punish governments that implement policies that reduce profitability, democratic decisions about economic policy are overruled by market forces. Davis sees that this creates a situation where meaningful change requires international coordination among movements that understand the global nature of the system they're fighting against. This doesn't mean imposing uniform solutions on different contexts, but it does mean recognizing that struggles against racism in the United States, against colonialism in Africa, against economic exploitation in Latin America, and against environmental destruction everywhere are aspects of the same global struggle against capitalism. The revolutionary alternative isn't just about changing economic relations. It's about creating new forms of international solidarity that can coordinate resistance across borders while respecting the autonomy and specificity of local struggles. This requires moving beyond the nation-state framework that currently organizes political thinking toward more flexible and democratic forms of international cooperation. One of Davis's most important contributions to revolutionary theory is her understanding that the process of revolution must prefigure the society we want to create. You can't use authoritarian means to create democratic ends, just as you can't use capitalist means to create socialist ends. The methods of struggle must embody the values and relationships of the world we're trying to build. This means that revolutionary movements must practice the democracy, equality, and cooperation they want to see in society as a whole. If movements reproduce hierarchies, competition, and exploitation within their own organizations, they'll reproduce these dynamics in any society they create. The revolution begins in how we treat each other in our organizing, not just in the political positions we advocate. Davis has seen how movements that fail to address their own internal dynamics often reproduce the oppression they claim to oppose. Male-dominated movements that marginalize women's voices end up perpetuating patriarchy even when they advocate for economic justice. White-dominated movements that ignore racism end up perpetuating white supremacy even when they advocate for socialist policies. Class-privileged movements that exclude working-class voices end up perpetuating elitism even when they advocate for workers' rights. This prefigurative approach extends to the question of violence in revolutionary struggle. Davis doesn't advocate for pacifism as an absolute principle, but she recognizes that movements that rely primarily on violence often end up reproducing violent relationships in the societies they create. The challenge is developing forms of resistance that can effectively challenge power while embodying the values of the world we want to create. This also means creating alternative institutions in the present that demonstrate the possibility of organizing society according to different principles. Community self-defense programs, cooperative economics, mutual aid networks, and democratic decision-making processes aren't just tactics for survival. They're experiments in revolutionary living that show what becomes possible when people organize according to principles of solidarity rather than competition. Davis's work on prison abolition reveals how revolutionary thinking requires questioning not just specific institutions, but the logic that underlies those institutions. The problem isn't just that prisons are overcrowded or understaffed or racist. The problem is the carceral logic that responds to social problems by caging people rather than addressing the conditions that create the problems. This carceral logic extends far beyond prisons to schools that increasingly resemble prisons, mental health systems that rely on involuntary commitment, immigration systems that depend on detention, and social services that punish people for poverty. The same logic that says criminals should be caged also says that poor people should be drug tested for benefits, that students should be surveilled and disciplined, that workers should be monitored and controlled. Abolishing this logic requires developing what Davis calls abolitionist imagination, the capacity to envision and create responses to harm that prioritize healing, accountability, and transformation rather than punishment and exclusion. This doesn't mean ignoring harm or pretending that conflict doesn't exist. It means developing community-based approaches to addressing harm that strengthen communities rather than dividing them. The abolitionist approach to harm recognizes that most of what we call crime is actually the result of social conditions that can be changed. Poverty, lack of education, absence of meaningful work, inadequate health care, social isolation, and trauma. Rather than responding to these conditions by punishing the people who suffer from them, abolitionist approaches work to change the conditions themselves. This requires not just different policies, but different ways of thinking about human beings and social problems. Instead of seeing people as inherently good or evil, abolitionist thinking recognizes that people's behavior is shaped by social conditions, and that changing conditions can change behavior. Instead of seeing punishment as necessary for accountability, abolitionist thinking develops forms of accountability that strengthen rather than harm communities. Perhaps Davis's most important contribution to revolutionary theory is her insistence that revolution requires imagination, the capacity to envision forms of social organization that don't currently exist, and to work toward creating those alternatives in the present. This imagination isn't utopian fantasy, but practical visioning that grounds current struggles in long-term goals. The capitalist system works hard to destroy this imagination by presenting itself as natural, inevitable, and eternal. People are taught that human beings are naturally competitive, greedy, and violent, so any system based on cooperation and solidarity is supposedly doomed to failure. They're told that markets are the most efficient way to allocate resources, so any alternative to market-based distribution is supposedly impractical. They're convinced that representative democracy is the best possible political system, so any form of direct democracy is supposedly chaotic. Davis shows that these claims aren't based on evidence but on ideology that serves the interests of those who benefit from current arrangements. Human beings are actually highly cooperative and social creatures who have organized themselves according to countless different principles throughout history. Markets are efficient at generating profits for capitalists, but they're terrible at meeting human needs or protecting the environment. Representative democracy allows people to choose between pre-selected options, but it doesn't give them real control over the decisions that affect their lives. Revolutionary imagination involves recovering knowledge of alternatives that have existed and experimenting with alternatives that could exist. This includes studying societies that have organized themselves according to principles of cooperation and mutual aid, learning from current experiments in democratic decision-making, and cooperative economics, and developing new approaches that address contemporary challenges. The revolutionary imagination also requires thinking at multiple timescales simultaneously. Revolutionary change doesn't happen overnight, but it also can't wait for some distant future. The challenge is developing strategies that create meaningful improvements in people's lives today, while building toward more fundamental transformations over time. So here's the truth that Angela Davis has spent her life articulating through decades of struggle and study. The choice between reform and revolution isn't a choice between gradual change and sudden change. It's a choice between preserving the system that creates suffering and building systems that prioritize human flourishing. Reform preserves capitalism while making it more bearable for some people. Revolution replaces capitalism with something fundamentally different. This choice can't be avoided by finding some middle path between reform and revolution. The middle path is reform, and reform has been tried for centuries. Every generation of liberals believes they can make capitalism humane, and every generation discovers that the system's core logic reasserts itself despite their best efforts. The problems you see around you, poverty, racism, environmental destruction, authoritarianism, war, aren't aberrations that can be corrected. They're products of a system that requires exploitation and domination to function. But recognizing the necessity of revolution doesn't mean embracing a particular blueprint for what revolutionary change should look like. Revolution isn't a single event, but a process of transformation that could take generations and will necessarily look different in different contexts. The question isn't whether you support this or that revolutionary strategy, but whether you're willing to commit yourself to the long-term work of building alternatives to capitalism. This work is already happening all around you, often in ways that don't announce themselves as revolutionary. Community gardens that provide free food, mutual aid networks that support people without means testing or bureaucracy, cooperative businesses that prioritize worker ownership over profit maximization, restorative justice processes that address harm without relying on punishment, community self-defense programs that protect people without relying on police. These aren't just nice projects that make life a little better under capitalism. They're experiments in revolutionary living that demonstrate the possibility of organizing society according to different principles. They're building blocks for a world beyond capitalism, and they need your participation to grow and succeed. The choice Davis presents isn't abstract or distant. It's immediate and practical. Every day you can choose whether to put your energy into reforming the system that oppresses you or building the systems that could replace it. You can choose whether to petition politicians for better policies or work with your neighbors to meet each other's needs directly. You can choose whether to wait for institutions to change or create new institutions that embody the values you want to see. Angela Davis didn't become a revolutionary because she was more radical or more angry than other people. She became a revolutionary because she recognized that the suffering she saw around her was systemic rather than accidental, and that systemic problems require systemic solutions. The same choice is available to you. Continue hoping that the system will somehow reform itself, or join the growing movement of people building the world that could replace it. The future is not predetermined. Capitalism is not eternal. Another world is possible, but only if enough people choose to build it. Your choice and your action matters more than you know. The revolution is not coming someday. The revolution is happening now. Wherever people choose cooperation over competition, solidarity over individualism, human needs over corporate profits, the question is whether you'll be part of it.